Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Cost Management for Dummies, hosted by Deltek. Joining me today is Kim Koster, Senior Director of PPM, and Tom Poland, Director of Solution Architecture at Deltek.
Hi, Raquel. Thank you very much. Yes, we're talking cost management. I'm Tom Poland, Director of Solutions Architecture, and Kim will be speaking up in a few minutes here, and we'll be having some good conversation and banter throughout. On prior sessions, it was just me for these Dummies webinars, and we've brought in another dummy. We brought in Kim, and we're going to have some fun today. We're going to have some conversation about the marriage, the literal marriage that you can create in your planning between scheduling and cost. And then also, I want to emphasize this. Raquel mentioned that we are taking questions today, and we are on the GoToWebinar control panel. In fact, one of our experts, not one of our dummies, but one of our experts, Jen Weber, is monitoring the questions box throughout the session today. So if you have a question even early on, she's going to try to answer you in real time, as long as she doesn't get overloaded with questions. And then she's going to raise up some questions at the end too that Kim and I will banter about as well. So let's get right into it here now that we've got that established. And let's do a little bit of a recap and what we've talked about in the past couple sessions. We talked about scheduling, and we talked about risk. And we made this analogy. I wasn't the best one to make this analogy because I'm not such a great cook, but I'm told in baking you want to have the right ingredients, you want to have the right quantities, and you want to plan for problems that can occur during program execution, or in this case, while you're baking your cake. You have to take things into account, like your oven and your altitude and all these things. Maybe you couldn't get the exact ingredient that you want, so you made a substitution, or someone that you're cooking for has a dietary preference. So there were contingencies and things that you need to take into account and effectively rebuild into your baseline. We talked about 9 very specific metrics used to ensure schedule quality. They're right here on the screen, and these are the 9 areas that through our own research we have learned are most closely associated with project success. Now you see 10 items there because the one on the far right is the score. That's the ability that we have to aggregate the performance of those 9 metrics and give you an overall feel of how your schedule is in terms of quality. The one we have in the example here is 23%, which isn't very good, and you can see it has things like excessive lags, hard constraints, and missing logic, things that prevent it from being a quality schedule and lower our score and ultimately lower our probability of success. Now risk, even though it might look like a 4-letter word, it's actually not a 4-letter word. It's something not to shy away from. We've really tried to make it easy enough where it's something almost any team can embrace. Why embrace it? Forecast accuracy, which we're going to be talking a ton about today. We're going to look at scope uncertainty and risk events, things that your team identifies can and maybe will go wrong during program execution. We talked about mapping the risk drivers and targeting the mitigation plans, and getting the charts and reports that show you the varying probabilities of project success. That varying probability piece is huge. That could be a wide range, and it might show that you may be successful, or you may not, or it might be a tight range of probable outcomes that gives you high confidence in completion, or high confidence that you won't complete on time. The fact is, risk isn't always going to give you the answer that you're looking for, but it's going to give you a more realistic view of where your project will finish. It effectively helps you see the future before the future happens, lets you optimize and take corrective action before there's bigger problems. Let's go to the next slide. And let's talk about this project maturity framework. In fact, you can see here with those check marks, we're working our way down the framework here as we go to as we have these different sessions. We started out a few weeks ago with S1 and S2. This is establishing your schedule baseline. And as we talk about cost and EAC and forecast today, that baseline is really the most important tool in our arsenal, because if we haven't done that well, everything else we talk about today is going to be filled with risk and just frankly won't be the right answer. Over to S3, which we talked about last time, the risk-adjusted schedule. Collaborate, work with the team, understand the threats, but then take the leap, the next step, and model those threats into the plan so that you have a risk-adjusted schedule, a more realistic view of when the project may actually finish compared to maybe the very optimistic plan that the team's put together. So as we continue down this framework today, we're heading into S3 to S4, which is where we're talking about optimizing our plan, understanding our forecast, and having a forecast which is tied to the plan. As simple as that sounds, we're going to put some numbers around that, and it's actually uncommon behavior. But the way Kim and I see it is if you do the uncommon, you're going to have a much easier time getting the results that you need out of the system. And let's start explaining what that means. So we'll really get into what we're talking about today. And going beyond just the schedule itself and looking at the bigger picture. We've got a three-legged stool here for program execution, executing the scope of what your company is signed up to do for this project. Well, there's three elements that make that successful. And moving from left to right, it's the time, the schedule, the sequence of events that gets you from point A to point B. I think last time I used a commute, literally getting from point A to point B, and all the things that can undermine that. Well, there's also a cost associated with that. If it's a road trip or my morning commute or whatever, that costs me money as well. It costs me wear and tear. It costs me gas. All those different things. And then quality, getting there in one piece. In the case of the commute, or in the case of your project, meeting your customers' requirements, doing it gracefully with style, and actually delivering something that which was intended to be delivered for doing the project. Now we say here schedule is king, and the fact is it becomes very difficult to do any of this without the schedule as the firm foundation of what you're planning to do. In other words, it's not very easy to tell me what something is going to cost me if you're not also aware of the schedule that it takes to get there, because you need time, money, and resources to get stuff done, and all those things cost money. So Kim, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Tom. I think that having a great schedule and that's sound and realistic is the only way that I can really get a good cost plan or a great cost plan. So without it, I really don't have a map of what the cost should look like and when the timing of those costs should incur. Now, no matter what kind of contract we're managing, whether it's cost plus, fixed price, T&M, or whether or not we have formal EV requirements or whether we don't, you need some kind of schedule to tell us exactly what you just talked about. What's the time, what's the cost, and hopefully we're going to get the quality that we need to deliver to the customer. So without those pieces and the scope, there's no way to get a good cost baseline or a resultant forecast. So let's start off by level setting exactly what a good PMB or budget is. So I'm going to talk about what a performance measurement baseline actually is. It's really the sum of all of the time phase budgets, so all of the breakdown of the work, tied back up to the top level, and then any what we call undistributed budget or UDB that we haven't assigned back to a control account yet, or to a work identified that back to any work. Now this really becomes the benchmark for which we'll measure all of our performance going forward. And that performance measurement baseline has to include, it's got its own stool by the way, it's got to include cost, schedule, and scope. All of that has to be baselined in order for this to work. So let's walk through what the characteristics of a good baseline look like. First, all scope needs to be included. So the schedule that Tom's giving us should definitely have all the scope included in it, and there's ways to assure that all that scope is included in the schedule. Just some suggestions would be, in the schedule, code all the tasks with the statement of work or the SAL reference. Or if you have an integrated master plan that's really outlining the phasing of the work, you can use the IDs for that master plan because it's going to tie to all of the scope definition on the contract. And then run a check, do a cross-check, making sure that you have all the scope included. A lot of times those budgeting tools will also have the ability to have scope references so that you can crosswalk between the schedule and your cost system. It also gives you, a lot of times those cost systems will give you the ability to put in a dictionary so that you have some idea of what the work scope actually is. So if somebody's just looking at the cost picture, they too can understand what the scope looks like. If we just have good processes in place, there's really no excuse in my mind for not having all the scope included in the contract. Or in the baseline, excuse me. We also have to make sure that that baseline is outlined in accordance with the work breakdown structure. And all the work breakdown structure is it's a hierarchical way to manage all the chunks of work. Okay, so it really just gives us a foundation reporting structure for the project. Now that work breakdown structure is typically product oriented. So it's very easy to go in then and look at what the cost is on the project today, and then if we had anything that we wanted to look at in the future, say for past performance. Now, depending on what industry you're in, there may be some guidelines that tell you how to structure your work breakdown structure. The next characteristic is really having it time phased. And that sounds so simple, but there's so many people that actually don't have budgets time phased throughout the life of the project. They only do it for the instant year. So, what we really want to do is get that entire project baselined and have it time phased by month. And to me, month is the minimum. So there are times that you may want to go down. I hear customers that want to go down weekly, but to me, monthly is probably the optimal way to look at it. There's other kinds of time phasing that you may want to see, like you may want to look at government fiscal years so that you can look at what the funding requirements are for the customer. They may want to know what that looks like. You may want to look at your company fiscal year so you can see what that impact may have been on revenue or on cash, and you also may want to look at it quarterly. So having the ability to slice and dice and parse that information in a time phase manner is really critical. Now, we'd also talk about schedule, and we've had a lot of conversation around schedule, and we want to integrate with that schedule directly. There's automated tools now that will send all the information directly from the IMS over into the cost management system, and so you actually tie one for one. And I'm talking about the dates, units. Hopefully your schedule is resource loaded, so that could be either hours or dollars, any kind of unit that we can cost when we get it over into the cost management system. The other thing that's really important is being able to track change to the baseline. Now, it's not just dollar amounts that we want to be able to trace, but we also want to be able to trace whether or not there's been a shift in the baseline, in the timing of it, because that's going to tell us that some scope has shifted out, the timing of the schedule has shifted out. Project logs that can be automatically generated make this a lot easier. It's a whole lot easier than it was back in the early 90s where we were keeping that log in Excel. Today you're able to get that and do that directly in the system. There's one thing on this that's not on this chart, but I think it's really important that you keep that baseline up to date because you don't want to be measuring against something that's obsolete. So we do things like rolling wave planning, where we plan maybe as far as practical into the future. That may be 6-7 months, but as we go in and we do our rolling wave planning, make sure that that baseline is up to date, that we've included all the new scopes or any deletes that we've had from scope, so any changes that we have. So I'll say it again, this is the PMB is another three-legged stool made up of cost, schedule, and scope. And if you have the above characteristics, you're going to have the makings of a great baseline for which you'll be able to measure your project execution against.
Kim, question for you.
Sure.
I've been taking some notes as we go here, and as you said, certain terms like time phasing, I've put a little check mark next to each of these terms, and I think time phasing was the most frequent term. I think I heard you say it 4 times while you were talking. And tell me a little more about that. I mean, you mentioned an integration with schedule. I know there's organizations where scheduling and finance are different disciplines, maybe even under different vice presidents. how does that best work? I think I know the answer because of one of your points, but I also see it attempted a lot of different ways. What would you say the best practice is, and what are some of the common pitfalls or problems if that best practice isn't used?
To me, the best practice is to have the schedule driving those time periods. So if we went into each task in the schedule and we loaded the resources into each task, okay, and then, those tasks then culminated up to a control account or a work package, whatever the next roll-up actually is, Tom, then those will all come across into the cost management system, and I'll have a calendar established that is by month, or most likely it's the company calendar that we already have, and we can link those two calendars up between the cost and the schedule system, and we're going to have that time phasing that we need. And the main thing about that is that, and I know we're going to talk about it later, but having those resources in the schedule and then having them pass over keeps you from having to reconcile. You don't know if you have cost and schedule integration. You're having to run separate reports, and that's not just for the baseline, but that's also for the estimate. So being able to have those dates moving over and the units that we're going to measure, hours, dollars, etc. I mean, that to me is the best practice, Tom.
Gotcha. So building that time phasing, not only building cost bottom up from the schedule plan, but then also the time phasing. It's not taking a $10 million project, saying it's 2 years, and saying it's $5 million per year. That's really easy for me to do. Look, I just time phased.
Exactly.
What you're saying is no, actually figure out when you're going to have the resources. Maybe 3/4 of that budget is material, and it's all needed in the first year. Well, my plan is no longer works. Your plan, based on the schedule, has the real needs, the real cash flow, the real understanding between supplier and customer as to who needs money when to be able to do the job. That's what I'm hearing.
Exactly, and you and I both know that that is not the way that most people handle it. Most people handle it from the other perspective, with them separate between the cost and the schedule. I mean, yeah, cost and schedule separate, and then having to try to reconcile.
Yeah, I've seen that lead to cash flow surprises, or they have the schedule baseline, but then there's kind of a cost expenditure plan from the government customer side, and they don't match up, so all of a sudden the contractor has to slow down work to meet a certain cost profile, when it really should have been the other way around.
Exactly.
Where the contractor should be fighting tooth and nail to hold that schedule, because that's the fashion in which they're also going to get paid.
Exactly.
Cool.
Okay, so let's move on to why forecasting is important. So we've got a performance measurement baseline, okay? And now let's move on to EACs and forecasting. So really now starting to look at the execution of the work. So the EAC and the forecast needs to be done not only in the cost system, but just we just talked about, Tom, we want to drive that from the schedule. So we want all the status of the schedule and all the work to go to be accounted for so that we can get a robust EAC. Now, the EAC really gives us a common way to look at the future. It gives us a prediction of what the final cost is going to be for the project. And just so that everybody knows, in case there's anybody who doesn't know what an EAC is, it's actually actuals plus estimate to complete, or really work to go. So that'll tell us at the end of the day exactly what that contract is going to cost the customer. And it'll also tell us internally how much profit we're going to have. If I've got it time-phased properly, then I'm going to know exactly what the revenue is, what my cash flow is, all that good stuff. We also want to make sure that's aligned with corporate goals. And I've got a chart a little bit that talks about how EAC actually builds up and affects all the key performance indices within a company. We're going to have delighted customers, so they're going to know what the funding is. There's so many times I walked in to a government customer and said, we're going to spend this much money, and realistically, I didn't have any idea how much money we were going to spend because our costs and our schedules weren't tied together. I was doing the best guess I could, which really affects your customer. To be able to work with them and understand exactly what funding is needed and when it's needed is huge for delighting them, and it's also to let them know that there's no surprises here. So they actually understand what it's going to cost, and they're not having to go back and beg for more money also. So we don't want to embarrass them. We also can understand our staffing needs. So since those EACs and baselines are resource loaded, so we'll be able to understand whether we need engineers or a certain skill set. We'll be able to look at that. If we're doing EACs in aggregate across a portfolio or an enterprise, we're able to actually look at total manpower across that enterprise. And this is going to help you remain competitive. So, it's going to be a differentiator because it helps you learn. It'll help you learn from the past, and it's going to give you that past performance that you need to manage new projects. To manage proposals. So being able to manage the proposals with the past performance, that's something. I was just at a conference last week, and they were talking about how important it was to protect your past performance. And I'd never really thought of it that way, but it's very important to do that. So making sure that you have a good plan, a good baseline, and all the good components help you with that overall EAC, and making sure that you can keep work, execute work, and bid new work. So let's talk a little bit about the 6 characteristics for a good EAC. I'm not going to say it again, Tom. Time-phased. That's the last time. That's the last time I'm going to say it. But they need to be time-phased also. So along with the baseline, it needs to be integrated with the schedule. So a lot of times I see customers right now who just want to put the baseline in the schedule, but do the EATCs separate. Do the work to go separate. I wouldn't recommend that. The best practice is to have all the work to go in the schedule and then driving over into the cost system. That way you make sure you have cost schedule integration. You also want to be able to account for contingencies. So, Tom is going to be, he talked about risk in the second webcast. He's going to be putting in mitigation plans into his schedule. And then those are going to be passing over into the EAC. So we want to make sure that we're getting all those and that we can account for all of those in case we have any kind of an audit. We also want to be able to look at rate differences. So we want to be able to have multiple different rate decks. So we want to be able to look at labor, overhead. I also want to be able to go in and look at if I have a rate change. So let's say my G&A is going to go up 10%. I want to be able to do a what if and see what the impact is to my project. And I can see too how much direct labor I may want to be reducing at that point. So really being able to do what ifs and compare different scenarios in order to optimize your EAC and optimize the workflow is huge. And then being able to do top-down planning. So to say, hey, I've got a certain amount of E1 that I can put in this budget or this EAC, and then have that spread over the time stamps, the dates that are actually in the schedule. That's a wonderful tool to be able to use, especially when you're beginning to start your baseline planning process. So the EAC really helps everybody operate from, the same manual. Everybody's doing the same thing.
Kim, on this slide, the characteristics of a good AAC slide, just go back to that real quick.
Sure.
The test for me, what I was doing as you were talking, is I was taking any one of these elements away and then seeing how I would explain a variance between my forecast and my baseline. Which,
exactly.
If they vary, you're going to have to explain. I really honed in. They're all important, especially rate differences. That might just be the explanation. But more commonly is we didn't think something was going to happen, but it did happen. That is code for we don't manage risk in any way, shape, or form. And that is a huge dissatisfier for the customer. It's one thing to have the variance, and on a lot of the government contracts that are out there, hey, a lot of them are cost reimbursable contracts. So there's the government's taking on a good amount of the risk, which we understand, but they also are going to need a very solid explanation of when there's variances from the plan, because they're the ones writing the check. They're owed the explanation, and it's normally in the contract to be able to provide the explanation. So even if I have the time-phased estimates and it's tightly integrated with the schedule, if I can't explain to them concisely and crisply why I have $1 million of anticipated cost growth, that whole contract is going to be in jeopardy from that point forward.
Exactly. Oh, I agree.
We can't just say, hey, we think some things are going to take longer than we anticipated. I need to be able to map that back to my risk register, to my risk plan, and say, hey guys, risks 4, 5, and 6 here on the risk register, it turns out they're probably all going to hit. We thought each one had a 25% chance. Now, unfortunately, we've had to increase the probabilities to nearly 100%. unless some of these mitigations are successful. Now, nobody wants to spend an additional $1 million, but at the same time, there might be a very legitimate explanation. It may have been pre-accounted for in risk, and now the risks might be getting realized. That's a reasonable conversation to have compared to, well, we didn't really anticipate X, Y, and Z. Oh, geez, you guys really don't know what you're doing. You're not in control of your process. How could you not know that that might happen? So,
and you want to be able to have that conversation. Your customer's going to be happy that you had the conversation. Well, they're not going to be happy. They may be mad at you, but they're still going to be happy that they're not being surprised and have to explain that to their boss and that they're completely caught off guard. At least we're able to be proactive rather than, oh my gosh, it's happened and we don't know what happened and here we go. At least you can present a plan if you have all these pieces in place.
the two words that come to mind that are bigger than any of this are respect and reputation.
Exactly.
Even when I overrun, if I can explain in advance, in my forecast, not my actuals, if I can explain in my forecast specifically why I am going to overrun, that's respect. It's mutual understanding. It's time to mitigate risk. Maybe the government or customer has some aces up their sleeve, and they can rally the right resources, but they wouldn't be able to do that if we weren't having the conversation up front. If it was a sunk cost, already spent money, there's nothing they can do. If it's still in the forecast, we at least have a shot to try to mitigate it before the money's spent.
That's a really good point. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the EAC and what it really means, because I believe that a lot of times we get very siloed down on our project teams and we really forget that the EAC as well as the budget are really important for the overall business plans. So it's a basic building block for forecasting revenue, net cash, profit, really, as we talked about earlier, understanding what the staffing loads need to look like, and then the financial results of the project, again, be using for bidding new projects in the way of past performance. So, it can't be taken lightly, this EAC, and how important it is. It's really going to help all the key performance indices that we have, cash, revenue, EBIT, profit, growth, new orders. It's truly affecting everything that we do. And having a robust EAC process is really going to be a competitive advantage for you going forward. Customers are going to have that respect that Tom was just talking about because you know what is happening on your project and you are managing it. Managing doesn't mean to me that nothing absolutely goes wrong. Managing means that we're handling everything that is coming at us and that we're planning for things that may happen in the future. So again, it really all starts with the EAC, and it is so critical to have all of that operating properly and reported up in a way that all the decision makers can actually use it. Okay, Tom.
Cool.
One of our favorite topics coming up.
Yeah, that's kind of what you're saying. It's kind of like maybe how a sports team manages a loss that they didn't expect, or they're going into the fourth quarter and they're getting blown out. The not so successful teams fall apart at that point. The successful teams manage with what happened today. They have the tools, they have the resources, and they might just have a shot at winning the game. But if they're not in control of themselves, if they're injured all over the field or whatever, they're not going to be able to do it. They've got to be able to have their act together, even if they lose one or two key players. It's the same thing with a project. Even if I overrun or I'm having risks realized in one or two key areas, what can I do as a high-performing team to get together, demonstrate control, use that control, and still win the day?
Exactly.
One of the ways to set back up, now I'm going to talk about time phasing and where it comes from. And my questions earlier, they were no coincidence. You're driving towards cost in this webinar, and I'm going to continue to be the voice of schedule. That's my background, is about 20 years of resource-loaded schedules. And in fact, for a long time, I was very privileged. I didn't know any other way, because the very first environment that I worked in was very heavy on the idea of resource and cost-loaded schedules. Only later would I find out that that's really the exception. It's probably only about the 20% case. So these great things that we're talking about today, and this time phasing and tight integration, it's not an easy thing. It's not something that everybody just does. So if you're listening to us today and you're saying, oh, geez, we don't do that. We're not at that level of maturity. Hey, none of us have been for times, and I've certainly been in environments past that first environment where I wasn't, and I had to rally the troops together to introduce that concept and fully prove it out. The number two here, that's kind of number one, that's the ideal scenario. Number two is managing that cost, having finance in that separate organization who don't communicate with the program control resources, yet they're doing the financial forecasting and the cash flow, but it's not really developed from the actual ebb and flow of the projects in the portfolio. You see, everything we're talking about today, A, it benefits the forecast for the individual project, but B, when you roll those up, you're doing portfolio level and even enterprise level cost management and forecasting. In fact, if you do number one at the granular project level, you get that enterprise and portfolio level cost analysis basically at no expense. It's just something that you get. And so that's kind of a hidden strength of number one, is that scales up to the enterprise, whereas number two often starts at the enterprise and then gets worked down, but it doesn't have a solid foundation. It's not built from the work that you're actually doing. So we much prefer number one, and that's really how Deltek has oriented its tools and resources to get you there. We recognize that many folks start and maybe continue on for a long period of time as number two, and we can't ignore that as well. So we really support both methods, but as we talk about these maturity frameworks and everything like that, they're constantly steering us towards the optimizations that you get when you're on the left side of the screen here on the number one.
Hey, Tom,
Yeah.
I've done some, number two where we had them separate, and I've done it where it's resource loaded. I found over and over again that even though the upfront work on the resource loading of the schedule was a little bit more time consuming, the back end of the managing the project was so much easier. And in number two, we spent so much time reconciling and trying to figure out what was wrong with our numbers and whether or not we had cost schedule integration. It actually cost a lot more to do number two than it did to do number one.
Kim, you just hit the number one objection right on, is the program manager saying, I've heard about those resource-loaded schedules. I understand that it might benefit some people, but it's going to take us too much time. And then I turn around and say, can you imagine the time that we're going to spend trying to get a good story together when there's variances if we can't actually trace our variances back to the work that we're performing? And at that point, they're not bought in, but I know I've got them when they say, well, what do you mean? And then I could lay it out for them, the preemptive approach, the proactive approach versus the fire drill approach that you end up trying to explain when you're doing doing method two here. There's always going to be variances. It's a matter of, again, controlling your process.
Yep.
All right, let's go to the next slide, my favorite slide. We asked people for wedding pictures as Kim and I were putting this presentation together. In fact, Kim came right to the table with a pet wedding. What could be better than a pet wedding? Well, what's almost as good is marriage between schedule and cost, where we have harmony between the two. We're firing on all cylinders. I think we're getting some echo here. Let me continue on here and see if that continues to be a problem. The resource-loaded schedule is a marriage between the work required and the resources needed. You can't plan your resources if you don't have a plan for when you're going to actually be performing the work. You don't want to have all of your resources available throughout the entirety of project execution. It's painfully inefficient, and it's going to cost you far more money than you need to spend. So what we're talking about here with the resource-loaded schedule, though, is very important, because you need to make sure that you have the buy-in to have the right resources available at the right time. That's where you need the plan to come in, that time phase sequence of activities to get the job done from point A to point B. So the demand for resources perfectly matches the resources that you have available. In some cases, When you don't have resources available when you would need them according to your schedule, you might need to change your schedule to line up with when you have the resources available. There's an art and science to that. Just because you have a plan doesn't mean you have the resources at that point in time, which means you either need new resources or you need a different plan. You can't do one or the other in a vacuum. They need to be done with respect to one another. Okay, back over to S1 to S5. I know we've hit this in the series of webcasts here about 3 or 4 times. Every time you step up, I can't say it better than this bullet, every time you step up to a higher state of maturity, you're creating a new version of the schedule. You started with the base, the uncritiqued schedule. You critiqued it, which means you have a new version. You risk adjusted it, which means you have a new version. You're optimizing it through resource availability, cost profiles. Can the customer afford to pay me in the time frame that I can deliver in? If they can't, I might need to optimize my work by delaying my work. We talked about that earlier. It'd be perfect to finish as quickly as possible and get paid, but if the customer doesn't have the funding to pay you according to that profile, you're doing work too quickly, quicker than they can pay you, and your resources might be optimally used somewhere else during that time and then engaged later on when the customer can pay you. There's an art and science to that. We have the tools that help you do that. The fact is, your schedule is going to change multiple times while you're climbing this level of maturity, both with your baseline and your portfolio of baselines. The key is to recognize that, be prepared for that, and that's where Kim was talking about. Baselining is not a one-time event. You're controlling your baseline, you're controlling your project, and you're modifying your baseline when needed. Kim, I'm sure you've been through the same thing, where government funding changes every year, and we've had to sometimes very, very quickly change the out years of work on our schedule to match the money that the government or customer anticipates they're going to have at a certain point of time. That sends me right back into this process, all the way back to S1 through critiquing that new sequence of events that's maybe longer or shorter depending on the funding. Hey, the government might say we have money this year but not next year, so let's get it done this year. Any change in plan needs to be reviewed S1 through S5, which is why you keep seeing it from us, not just inception of the project, but now as we're even further into the S3 and S4 phases of the project.
Okay, so I'm going to take it now from that place to earn value. So I just want everybody to know, if you're interested in earned value, we also have a Dummies book for that, and you can go out to the deltek.com website and you can get the Dummies book. It's a really great reference. It boils EV down to just a simple project management process, which honestly, that's all earned value management is. It's, the intersection of cost, schedule, and scope, just exactly what we've been talking about today, and it says here, it's another marriage, cost and schedule. Those are just the basics. This earned value book also has a chapter on dispelling myths like, EV's too hard, we shouldn't do it on manufacturing type projects, we shouldn't do it unless the government makes us. Earned value really is just sound project management 101, telling us not just what we've done, but it's also going to predict where we're going to go in the future. So, please go out there and get it. It's free. It's a great reference. It's got all the calculations and the indices, everything that you need to, understand EV. And if you have some subcontractors that you want to give that to that are new to it, this is a great tool for them. Now, I've said this about a million times today, and I can't say it enough, because a lot of times we just rush in, start doing cost plans, but we really need a good schedule in order to start. So having this S1, S5 framework is a great way to manage cost, schedule, as well as risk. Okay, so each one of those. And, and I can take costs down from each one of the schedules that Tom talked about, where he's morphing the schedule as he's moving along. We may also want to look at the impact of those changes from a cost perspective. It's not just completely one way. So if you've got a great plan and you're statusing that plan on a regular cadence, and you integrate your schedule to your cost system, you've resource loaded it, then ultimately you get earned value management for free. So, we said that a couple of different times, and people just really don't believe us. But if you're driving everything from the schedule, there's absolutely no reason why, and you're doing what you should for good schedule practices, and it's coming over directly into the cost management system, there's really no reason I wouldn't want to do EV on every revenue generating project that I had, making sure that I understand where I am from a performance perspective. So, Tom, you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely, Kim. Absolutely. Nothing more to add. You got it.
Okay, perfect. So, we've talked a lot about baselines and forecasts, but let's also talk a little bit about actuals. So, a lot of times on some of the larger projects I've worked on, the larger companies I've worked at, we had a generic ERP. So it really gave us a two-dimensional look at the business. That two-dimensional look was really the chart of accounts for the accountants and then the organization or the department. What was missing was the project link. Because projects are not tied to the fold, the business really has poor visibility, assumed revenues, all these things that we're talking about here. Everything's very manual. There's a lot of recalculations. You may not even know what the cost on your project actually is because cost may be not being passed down to the project. It may be getting stuck in the general ledger. You also may have heavy customization in order to be able to get reports out of the system. One thing too is if it's separated. I saw one a couple of weeks ago where everything was separate and the materials actually were not getting down to the project. They were getting stuck. So they really didn't have an accurate cost. They had no way to understand, what was going on from an actuals perspective. And to me, that's just the most basic piece of an accounting system, is being able to get that information down to the project. So the reason the generic ERP often fails is because, again, it just slaps projects onto the top. It's kind of like, just a pancake. And we're always looking then in the rearview mirror because we really can't manage those costs. We don't know what they are. They may not be getting there in time. And ultimately, it makes us have no control over our project cost. But if you have a true project-based ERP system, you can really see the world in 3D. So it really it's kind of like a cube, and it's got three different components. The first one is that general ledger account, and that general ledger account describes the expense. So it tells us what we're spending it on, hotel costs, material, labor, subcontracts. That's really the chart of accounts that I spoke about earlier. The organization may be a functional group, so it may be, finance, engineering, manufacturing. So it describes who's doing the work, and then the project is where the value of the service, the things that are being delivered to the customer or the client. And for project-based businesses, that's really where the economic value is being created. That's where the billings and all the revenues and all the profit come from. It's really what makes businesses that are project-based stay in business. So when you actually have inputs coming into the side through the account org proj, you're actually able to target all those costs down to the project level. So you have financial reports, invoices, payroll. You actually get true status reports that tell us where we're performing from a project. You also have on those reports, you'll have your funding. You'll know how much funding you've got. You're going to understand what your contract value is, what mods have been, what mods that you have, which helps with your scope definition. So, having a project-based solution really does help you manage your projects. So we just wanted to make sure that we did not leave that one piece of the business out, because actuals are a huge part of being able to understand where we are and being able to execute. So again, we have another Dummies book. We have a fairly large Dummies library at this point, and this one's on project-based ERP. You can go out and grab that. It's for free, and it will help you really understand the mysterious ERP systems and how they're going to help you from both a project costing and a schedule perspective, things that you're dealing with on a daily basis. So, Tom?
Cool. Yes, and we also have our Planning a Great Project for Dummies book in which this series is based, coming up on November 6th. We have a great one coming up. In fact, we're kind of talking about some newer, more advanced concepts where we've recently made some innovations with, which is both the optimization, but notably the consensus building piece as well. Also at deltek.com, we not only have these Dummies books, the information on the upcoming seminars and webinars, but then also recordings in case you missed scheduling for dummies or risk management for dummies. As recorded, as presented, those webinars are out there as well. And as Kim mentioned, all these Dummies books, they're completely free of charge. They're available for download. Sometimes we have hard copies if you see us at a conference or something, but we always give you the ability to go out, get these books free of charge, no credit card number, no money changes hands. They're our gift to you, and they're actually really good. I'll be the first to admit, the first time I picked one of these up, I thought maybe it was going to be an advertisement or something like that. It's actual real information that in fact I wish I'd had in my hands earlier. So legitimately good stuff out there in each one of these books. The Planning a Great Project one is particularly dear to me because it really does consolidate a lot of these different concepts in one place. If we don't plan, we're not setting ourselves up for success. So what better place to start than this Planning a Great Project for Dummies book, and then getting into the earned value and the ERP, etc. Now, Jen, you've been monitoring the feed throughout the presentation here, answering some questions. What are some of the questions that have come in that Kim and I might be able to address?
Sure. First one is, what do you suggest using to assure total scope comprehension in the schedule?
Total scope comprehension in the schedule. So let's see. Let's describe this here. This is making sure that the schedule accounts for everything that the customer is expecting you to do, and then also making sure that the schedule doesn't contain things that the customer is not expecting you to do. Let's see here. Kim mentioned a couple things during the presentation. She mentioned statement of work reference appearing in the schedule. I think that's a great starting point. I also think that that needs to be trusted but verified as well. When I've come in and done audits on subcontractors and whatnot, I will take the statement of work in my hand, and I will find any random sentence in it, in any random paragraph, and I will want to be able to find in the schedule where that work is covered. Conversely, I will want to take any task in the schedule and make sure that it has that statement of work reference number populated, but I'm going to test that as well. Mm-hmm. And the way to do that is pretty old school. Have the statement of work in your hand and the schedule up on the screen, and test as many of those relationships as you have time for. Hopefully all of them, all the WBS areas. Because the reason why that's particularly important in government contracting or in any cost reimbursable contract arrangement is if you, the contractor, are working on something and it can't readily be mapped to the statement of work, the question is immediately raised, A, why are you working on that? And B, why would I be paying you for that, and why are you billing for it? Frankly, from an audit perspective, it can be an indicator of fraud if those two aren't mapped one-to-one. Now, I don't think anyone out there is out there intentionally committing fraud or anything like that, but the government's prerogative and your customer's prerogative is to look for indicators that they are getting and only getting the things that they're paying you to do as part of the scope.
Don't you think too that the project managers are the last stop, but really the responsibility is down with the IPT leads as well as any team that's operating, any kind of product team that may be operating, or the control account manager, putting them really responsible for making sure all of that's in, and any kind of coding, any kind of crosswalking that we're doing, the program manager should be the last stop.
Yes.
Not the first stop. It should be, everybody should be accountable down at those lower levels.
Yes, this is a show me that you are in control of what you're managing, and that you understand what you're managing, and you understand what you're not responsible for. Those are, all those questions need to be answered. And if I'm in, reviewing, auditing, that's a show me type thing. Show me where your work is in the statement of work. Show me where it is in the schedule.
Yeah.
And there should be a one-to-one relationship. This isn't difficult. I know I'm using words like fraud and everything like that. I don't want anyone getting scared. It's actually not a difficult exercise. But honestly, Kim, and I don't understand necessarily why, it's one of the most neglected exercises I've seen on project teams that should know better, that should know that they should only be doing, and they should be double checking to make sure that their plan, A, encompasses all of the work that they're responsible for the statement of work, and then B, doesn't encompass any work that they're not responsible for in the statement of work. It's really easy to do. It just needs to be done.
In the Clarity survey for this last year, that's a government contracting survey that Deltek actually does. Its scope comprehension was number three challenge. So people are still challenged by that, and there was a lot of interest in it this last year as we went through some turbulent times, and people really had to understand what scope their scope actually was, and there was not going to be much tolerance for not understanding that, and there was not going to be any tolerance for scope creep either, from the government contractors. No more, hey, I'm just going to do something because you asked me to in an email. So really being able to track this has been something that's forefront in everybody's mind right now.
Gotcha. Yeah, that shared understanding of scope between contractor and customer. It sounds trivial, and like I said, it's not hard, but it's easy to skip.
Exactly.
Our next question asks if you could talk about representing planning packages and a fully resource-loaded IMS that ties out to the PMB.
I'll talk about that. I am, I'm going to break a planning package down in the schedule as far down as I can. It's practical. Okay, I'm going to have enough. I have enough fidelity to be able to estimate and load those planning packages. I believe they should be in there. I believe they should be resource loaded for labor and material. So I also, and while I'm on that vein, I also think level of effort should also be resource loaded as a part of the schedule. Not necessarily something that we don't want LOE to end up on the critical path, but I want to be able to look at the schedule and make sure that I've got every single resource that I need, and that I understand what that is, and then it ties back to the cost system. So many times we want to leave pieces out from the schedule and not resource load those, and then I've got a reconciliation point between cost and schedule, and there's ways to handle that in the schedule so that it does not affect, and LOE doesn't end up on a critical path, those are the things that I think are very important to make sure that I've got every single resource in one place driving to the other place. So, Tom, I don't know what your opinion is on that.
Agreed completely. When I hear terms like on-top adjustment, there's a time and a place for some of these things, but I get nervous, and I always try to find a way to have that represented in the plan. By plan, I mean schedule, resource-loaded schedule, versus getting part of my cost picture from the schedule and another part from a spreadsheet. I know how I would look at that as a reviewer. If I were conducting an IBR or an audit, I would be very, very skeptical that it's really not a bottom-up view, well-planned view of cost. Part of it's planned and part of it is made up. Now, hopefully it's not made up, but that's how I'm going to perceive it. If it doesn't match, if the cost and resource baseline doesn't match up to a logical sequence of tasks, and that can be planning packages, that's fine. But that, to me, is much more preferable than saying, okay, we've detailed planned the next year and a half, but then after that, we just look at this spreadsheet model. I become very skeptical in a hurry.
I agree. We got any other ones, Jen?
I don't think so. I guess if there aren't any other questions, Raquel, do you want to take over?
Thanks, Jen. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and please visit deltek.com/events for more upcoming Deltek events.